Today's hearing is titled Overreach, an examination of federal statutory and regulatory crimes. We could have just as easily called it oversight of Congress, because in many respects, Congress has created the problem that we're here to discuss today. The problem is the number of federal and regulatory crimes has escalated out of control to the point that law-abiding Americans unknowingly commit several crimes every day. According to one study, the average American commits 3 felonies per day, which does not take into account the overwhelming number of misdemeanors or civil violations. In some instances, the laws are so obscure and vague that even law enforcement and federal agencies are unaware that they exist. The United States Code is estimated to contain more than 5,000 crimes today. Just a decade ago, some scholars estimated that these were approximately 4,500 crimes, and the fact that these numbers are just estimates underscores the severity of the problem. Ms. Tylek is the founder and executive director of Worth Rises, a nonprofit organization that advocates for reform in the criminal justice system. She has previously worked at the Brennan Center for Justice and the ACLU and co-founded College Way, a program that worked to prepare students in Rikers Island to pursue higher education upon their release. Thank you for being with us, Ms. Tylek.
I am Bianca Tylek, Executive Director of Worth Rises, a national organization working to remove the financial incentives to incarcerate people. I'm also a crime victim, and I've had a loved one who's been murdered. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you to discuss the issue of overcriminalization. We all want safe and thriving communities, and we can get there by working together. While the others on this panel are and will continue to speak about some of the legal specifics of overreach in the criminal code, I will cover, which I also cover in my written testimony, I will focus my comments today on the impact that federal overcriminalization has on the American people. To start, any discussion of overcriminalization at the federal level must reflect on the significant influence it has over state policies, especially when funding is attached. This was the case throughout the 1990s and 2000s when Congress provided federal funding for prison construction to states that enacted tough and crime laws like mandatory minimums. Unfortunately today, federal programs like civil asset forfeiture continue to root the issue of federal overcriminalization in state and local budgetary policy. As a result of overcriminalization at the federal and state level, someone is arrested every 3 seconds in the United States. This amounts to 10.5 million arrests annually, with over 80% for low-level offenses like drugs and disorderly conduct. Those arrested are disproportionately Black and brown and low-income people, leading to the over-incarceration and over-surveillance of these communities. Core to the overcriminalization crisis is that even committing a minor offense can impart a lifetime of negative consequences. A simple arrest can lead to job loss, while a criminal conviction, and worse yet, incarceration, can threaten the financial stability and economic mobility of the person convicted and their family for years, even generations to come. Consider that roughly 57% of people in federal prison are the parents of minor children, and more than half were the primary breadwinners for their families before they were incarcerated. Though most incarcerated people in prison work, their penny wages prevent them from sending anything home. So unsurprisingly, about half of families with an incarcerated loved one struggle to make ends meet. And it's not just the loss of income at issue, but families end up with new, egregious expenses for basic food and hygiene products and communication services for their incarcerated loved ones. To make matters worse, funds deposited by families for their incarcerated loved ones can be garnished for court fines and fees. The Federal Bureau of Prisons recently sought to garnish as much as 75% of what families deposited. Thankfully, Congress has recently created some relief. For decades, 1 in 3 families with an incarcerated loved one has gone into debt trying to stay connected over expensive calls. Some cut off contact unable to afford it, which is detrimental to correctional officers and public safety, with studies repeatedly showing that when incarcerated people are connected to their support systems, facility violence decreases and reentry success increases. But Congress passed the Martha Wright Reed Just and Reasonable Communications Act to increase regulation of the prison telecom industry and made all calls free in federal prisons through the CARES Act, a policy I urge Congress to implement permanently. For too long, women like Martha Wright Reed, who skipped medication to afford calls with her grandson in federal prison, have carried the cost of overcriminalization. Indeed, over 80% of carceral costs, like the cost of calls, commissary, and court fees are borne by women, largely Black and brown women. See, the issue of overcriminalization is not just about criminal justice. It's about gender equity, children's health, family unity, economic justice, and more that we don't have the time to talk about today, like privacy rights and regressive taxes. The intersection of these issues, all or one of which may matter to you, should bring us collectively to the table to address them. And importantly, overcriminalization does not just impact those arrested and sentenced, but all of us. Overcriminalization dramatically hinders public safety by exacerbating the social conditions that lead to crime in the first place. But in doing so, it lines the pockets of the $80 billion niche prison industry with a deep financial interest in the overcriminalization of Americans. In fact, major players in the prison industry have plainly stated that declining crime rates, which improve our safety, hurt their business. An industry so offensive that it cannot advertise uses public fear-mongering to hide its interests and boost its business. A huge reason for overcriminalization, the prison industry is an impediment to passing smart policies that promote safety, freedom, and justice, and we must put an end to it. In closing, I would be remiss not to mention that the roots of overcriminalization and even the prison industry date back to the exception in the 13th Amendment, which gave way for the passage of Black codes during the Reconstruction era that applied only to newly freed Black people and criminalized minor offenses like vagrancy to feed the brutal practice of convict leasing by which states leased incarcerated people to private businesses. More than a century later, slavery is still legal as criminal punishment.
Your time's expired.
Okay, I have two
Wrap it up.
sentences.
Okay, all right.
More than a century later, slavery is still legal as criminal punishment, and we are still overcriminalizing minor offenses with a disproportionate impact on Black and brown people. I urge you to not just seek minor tweaks to existing policy, but truly shift the trajectory of our country by ending the exception in the 13th Amendment, ending federal overcriminalization, and using the federal power of the purse to incentivize state and localities to do the same. I appreciate the opportunity.
Are you saying in your testimony that slavery still exists in America?
Excuse me. Yes, slavery is actually still legal in America. It's not just only that it exists in practice, but according to the 13th Amendment, there's an exception clause that says except as punishment for a crime, which means, by law, slavery is still allowed.
Ms. Tylek, you launched the Corrections Accountability Project at the Urban Justice Center. As I understand it, the goal was to eliminate the influence of commercial interests on the criminal justice system and those it touches. Could you explain the various ways in which the criminal justice system has been financially exploited?
Absolutely, thank you. The Corrections Accountability Project is the predecessor to Worth Rises. And I think one of the ways to think about it is the ways in which the prison industry is both working in tandem with sort of the correctional system, but also at times exploiting the correctional system for its own gains. And so, what we see is a massive industry that has been built, and oftentimes, sometimes in conflict with the correctional system. So a correctional system that wants to provide care with correctional health care companies that are actually cutting costs dramatically and in many ways harming people significantly inside of prisons and jails. And so that's just one example, but there is a really broad industry here that has kind of leached its way onto our carceral system.
And so you believe that the prison industry has come to depend on stripping people of their liberty?
Absolutely. I mean, in fact, if you take the biggest example, right, the private prison operators that are actually publicly traded, they have minimum occupancy guarantees embedded in their contracts with agencies that are 80%, 90% requiring all of their beds, or 80% or 90% of their beds to be filled. So there's no doubt that they have an interest in putting more people behind bars.
Do you believe the private prison industry should be abolished?
Absolutely. I think there's no world that we can have a just system where people are profiting off of putting people in prisons and jails. There's only two ways for a business to make money, and my career before what I do today was on Wall Street, and I worked at the Goldman Sachs and the Morgan Stanleys and the Citigroups of the world. And there's two ways you make money. You either increase revenue, which for the prison industry means more bodies behind bars for longer, or you cut costs, expenses, which means basically worse quality and care.
And how does the prison industry work to increase the number of prisoners?
They lobby and they give campaign financing donations to those who are interested in tough on crime laws. They have done that extensively.
Now, thank you. Approximately 68 million Americans have a criminal record. We're aware of the direct costs of law enforcement, prison, and courts, as well as the cost to businesses and the economy. Can you discuss the cost to the individual of having a criminal record? How does it impact their quality of life and their ability to contribute to society and the overall economy?
So there are all 45,000 collateral consequences to being incarcerated. These, and just having a criminal conviction generally, these collateral consequences can impact your ability to get housing or access public assistance. As was mentioned, it can impact your ability to get a professional license, which can hinder your future sort of income. In fact, when people are incarcerated, their families immediately see a decline of income of 22%, and even when they come home, income is depressed by 15% after incarceration. What that does is it hinders their ability to sort of grow economically up the ladder, and not just for them, but also their families.
Is there a correlation between collateral consequences that hinder the reintegration into society of offenders and recidivism rates?
Absolutely. As I said earlier, there's no way to think about a world in which you're creating more crime, creating more collateral consequences, creating a situation and people have less economic opportunity, and expecting them to be able to exist in the society productively, right? At the end of the day, people will do what they need to do to make ends meet, to eat, to find a place to sleep, right? We are seeing these cases of people who have nowhere else to turn but sleeping on the street, and those becoming criminalized behaviors.
And finally, what needs to be done to improve reentry outcomes?
We need to invest in community support. The reality is that prisons were not meant for care, and that if we really want to address the social ills that lead to criminal behavior, we need to provide support and fund that support in community.
How about how medical care and food for the inmates come into play in terms of privatization?
I think in our time, I want to really specifically address healthcare, because healthcare in prisons and jails right now is under attack. It has been completely, in many cases, privatized. And one of the most egregious examples of sort of bankruptcy fraud and some things happening currently is Corizon's bankruptcy. So for those who aren't aware, Corizon—
Time has expired, but you may continue your answer.
I'll just say really quickly, Corizon is a major correctional healthcare company that was saddled with over $1 billion in lawsuits and settlements, and they separated the company into two, gave one half all the liabilities, the other half all of the assets, and then they bankrupted the liabilities and all the families who lost their loved ones.
Kind of like the Sackler family.
What has your work taught you about the connection between addiction and incarceration? Specifically, what impact does incarceration have on somebody struggling with addiction?
Thank you. So drugs are actually the #1 arrested crime in the entire country. So of all those crimes that we're talking about, drugs is the center of everything. And that, is in part because of the failed war on drugs that we've seen over all these years, and the reality that there is no way to incarcerate our way out of drug addiction. Drug addiction does, in many cases, have the dual diagnosis of mental health, where people are trying to self-medicate. And so that you can't really separate drug addiction from the issue of mental health in many cases. And over the last, since the 1950s, 1960s, we have completely deinstitutionalized all support for mental health, right? And so as a result, we have 350,000 people who are incarcerated today with a serious mental illness, not just a history of mental illness. And so what we really need is we actually need a care approach to drug addiction. We need to be actually providing treatment, and there is nothing about prisons, the way they are built, the way they are designed, the way they are financed, the way they are structured, that is meant to help deal with drug addiction. Those things need to happen in our community, and we need to be investing them through harm reduction and then further efforts to actually get people back to productivity. Today, they still can run up to about 75 cents a minute in 2024.
And would cost a hardworking, maybe hourly compensated person how much? What would they wind up? They're taking care of the children, they're taking care of the grandchildren?
We're talking about a few $100s a month, and for people who are incarcerated that are either making nothing or 9 cents, 10 cents, 15 cents an hour, it can be hours worth of labor before they can get a simple 15-minute call.
So what has been a hourly charge, not hourly, but what has been a meager offense may wind up bankrolling, not bankrolling you, may wind up breaking your account literally.
Absolutely. 1 in 3 families are going into debt over the cost of a simple phone call in 2024.
I'm going to ask all of you this question before, and I want you to think about it, because I appreciate all of you have produced in your documents and in your testimony today some reform movement that you think we should do. I want each one of you to give us the lowest hanging fruit, because that's always the easiest for Congress to do.
I don't know if it's the lowest hanging fruit, but I do think ending the exception in the 13th Amendment is a critical step for our country. And in the 250th year anniversary that's coming, I would say that.
Okay, you're right, that may not be the lowest hanging fruit.
Okay, make phone calls free in federal prisons permanently. You already
Okay.
did it in the CARES Act. We can just make it permanent policy.